Now your host, an advocate for the people and our Constitution, Denise Mraz.
Hello, folks. Hello out there. It's a great day in April, and this is Denise Mraz on Vegas Views. I would love to hear from you today, 702-650-KKVV. And if you're listening online, just kkvv.com. Listen on your phone, 605-313-0630, and let's get right into it. What a busy week it has been. I we are living in a Class A miracle time. There's just absolutely no doubt about it. So remember when Trump said with Q that this is the storm and he's working on the plan and the plan is in place and this has been something that has been going on, for decades. It's been planned. Well, I was looking up the definition of quarantine the other day because I have seen a lot of good memes on quarantine, and basically quarantine is a wonderful, it's defined by having restriction with respect to people who are medically fragile, right? So, and there's lots of definitions about quarantine. In fact, if you look in dictionary.com, the second definition of quarantine is a period of and originally 40 days of detention or isolation upon a ship. And this is for persons, plants, animals, or for some reason regarding infectious diseases. I read that a second time. I said, well, that's pretty interesting. 40 days. What other story do we have about the greatest storm of all time? Virtually any Bible you pick up, and there are many versions of the Bible, and they all have a flood story on them, and the flood stories all last for 40 days. So I started looking into this Q quarantine 40 days, and I went back so Trump said, I would love to have the United States open on Easter. That was his goal, right? So if you look at the whole symbolic, Jesus had risen from the dead, Easter Sunday's the celebration of him, you know, winning in hell, coming out in Easter, and we all celebrate. Well, if you go back in the timeline, you can see what event occurred if we look at Easter as the 40th day. Well, I can tell you. Trump initiated the merging of the Federal Reserve into the U.S. Treasury. It happened 40 days from Easter. So if the 40th day would have been Easter, 40 days before that was when he merged and initiated that merge. We knew it was coming. We just didn't know how, we didn't know when. And obviously, there's the old adage, follow the money. So when we follow the money and we look into things, and I'm starting to put some more things together and wanted callers to call in and see what they thought too. But I mean, aren't we all on this Noah's Ark together in the biggest storm ever in modern history? I mean, it's called the storm, and the storm is part of the plan. The plan was to retake our constitutional republic, and how can we do that? We had to take back the bank. We had to resubmit the federal money system to our standards that were set forth in the Constitution and put everything back in the box. And when I came across this today, I thought, that's a great takeoff for our show today in Vegas Views. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the banking system. So in my life, just in the last few days, I've had some very interesting characters come in, and they have told me about some of the early days of banking and the banking system. And these were things I didn't know about, and I thought that you might be interested in them too. So if we look at the banking system from a very early time, and this is even in Greek and Roman times, The church gave value to itself because people didn't read or they couldn't read. And they had books and knowledge, and the Pharisees and the various, you know, I'll call it church officials. They came by all different types of names, were the voice to the people from God, and this voice had interpretations, it had opinions. And if you were poor and you didn't know how to read, if you would give your tithing to the church, that was your spot that you can have a place in the church and listen to the Word of God. And you did that through tithing. It was a taxation, but it was a voluntary taxation. So you didn't have to read. You could go out and be a farmer. You could be a merchant. But when we didn't read and we didn't have math and we didn't follow the humanities, then we were essentially keeping ourselves from commerce. That's why because to have commerce and be a merchant and be somebody who is profiting from commerce and using all of our facilities to profit for our own life, liberty, and property, you have to be good at commerce. So look at the things that attacked commerce in our lifetime. Well, the modern bank is pretty much just a it's a bigger, more complex system of banks from, I'll call it time immemorial. And this story was told to me today, so let me see if I can get this right, and then you tell me what you think. So here's how fractional reserve banking started. It started in the times of before Jesus. And how it worked was the people were working the land, things were prosperous, and essentially the elitist owned all the land. But they had schemes and property rights and titles and leases and all of the tools that we have today, they had then, they were simpler. But what they noticed was when they found the gold, or they had gold, or things of value on people's property, they would put it in a vault. Now, vaults eventually merged into trusts in modern times. But here's what the bankers learned. They learned that instead of the farmers and the merchants coming to the bank, which could be 50 miles away, 100 miles away, um, what they did is they took the gold and the silver and the other precious metals and said, hey, we'll vault this for you. And who did this? Who were the elitists at that time were the goldsmiths, which, by the way, is a very popular Jewish last name. So the goldsmiths took the gold and the precious metals and they put it in vaults. For the owners of this property, they came along and said, instead of you coming to the bank all the time and exchanging these precious metals, what we would love to do for you is give you a safe keeping receipt. And the people happily took it because the safekeeping receipt was so much more portable, it was easier, it was something that was a promise, and it was harder to steal. But they started using the safekeeping receipts as money trade, trading it as paper money. And so the goldsmiths, they scratched their head. They said, wow, this is getting really popular. I wonder if we can capitalize on this. So what they did is they started trading among each other, the goldsmiths, and they started fractional reserve banking by trading on each other's safekeeping receipts. And it first kind of started out as a kind of a bet because they found out that as people aged, they wanted to come to visit their gold less, they were not depositing as much, they weren't cashing in their safekeeping receipts, they would get stolen, they would get lost, the people would die, the inheritance was split various ways. And over time, over decades, they learned that the people left their gold in the vault and that they didn't have to make good on the safekeeping receipts. So that's how they started to form what is today our fractional banking system. Now, obviously, it's much more complex than that, and we can get into that in another conversation. But I was just really intrigued by this whole process because when you think of the central bank, you think of it as something that's tied to the Titanic, to Jekyll Island, to the Federal Reserve Act of 1919. You think of it as sort of a modern day, uh, act, but it's been going on for centuries. That's why it's so perfected. So this was very interesting to me, and I thought I would share that with you. This whole concept of banking and loaning money and having us essentially become enslaved to the bankers. This is a process that's been perfected over a long period of time. But just think of how it was all wiped out in the storm. Now let's say we're all in the ark and we're getting antsy because we've been in house arrest, which, by the way, I did write today. There are a number of class action lawsuits around the country, and Attorney General Barr said that he would back plaintiffs on lawsuits regarding stay at home orders, especially for the right to worship. So if you go to our righttoworship.com website, you'll be able to make a pledge, and that could just be your name. It doesn't have to be money. But you can participate in these as a national, there's national class action lawsuits coming up. So they're based on the stay-at-home orders, that the orders were essentially unconstitutional, therefore illegal. And some people say, well, Trump's shut down the country. No, he's reminded us often that these were just guidelines. Everything was just guidelines. That wasn't an order, it wasn't a mandate. It wasn't a shall, it was a shall. It wasn't a must. That's where the governors made their mistake and essentially trying to start this governor's coup by all 50 states getting involved with a coordinated effort, and that's the key. It was a coordinated effort between governors to usurp Trump, because as we know, if after all 50 states declare a national emergency per an act from 1979, the director of FEMA becomes the President of the United States. But Trump reminds us in a memorandum from last week that, well, that's not actually totally true, because there's also a 1948 memorandum on the books that asserts that the Department of Veteran Affairs becomes the lead in the country. Why is that? Because he's activating the veterans. So the idea behind that 1948 order was, we have all these people from World War II, they're very well trained, and if in fact we ever had an emergency or a disaster at home, we had all these well-trained veterans that would come to the aid of the American people on our own soil. So that's kind of where all that came from. But anyway, going back to some of these stay-at-home order situations, so these are all class actions. I wrote down a list. There's right to worship class actions, right to travel, which is, these are all constitutional principles that we have a right to travel. Those were shut down by the house arrest. A right to assemble, which was threatened. And then we've also got a commerce clause infraction, because we, as people who are allowed to spend our money how we wish, had an opportunity to obviously tithe at churches, especially on Easter. Easter is one of their biggest days. So the governors knew that hurting churches at Easter would be a terrible thing because obviously they have leases to pay and bills to pay too. So I believe it was all coordinated and planned. But the fact that people were picking winners and losers by um, infringing on our rights to assemble, a right to worship, and right to travel to that worship is a really good lawsuit. It's growing a lot of legs, and we know that Barr just said that he will support it. So if the local courts don't hold this up, then it can go over to the federal courts. And federal courts are somewhat limited because there's certain scopes of subjects that federal courts take on that state courts don't. But that's a whole nother conversation. In from my opinion, I said they were picking winners and losers from day one. I was against it. I was against the shutdown. You'd never see a stay-at-home button on my Facebook, I'll tell you that much. And one thing very interesting in Nevada was that the stadium and other projects kept construction going. Now, if you've ever been to a construction site, you see people working together because that's what they have to do. They're lifting heavy things, they're talking, they're looking at plans, they're, coordinating their efforts. It's very, very common on a construction site. Yet, Sisolak decided to pick winners and losers by allowing construction to continue, but denying small business owners the right to keep their retail outlets open. And if you ever want to see an economy fail faster, cut out the small business owner because Trump has said multiple times over 50% of our gross economic prowess lies in the fate of the small business economy and the small business owners. Lots of people know that. So that was just something that I wanted to kind of put out there was these class action lawsuits. Um, Sunday we had a great Freedom Rocks event, and the next one is going to be on May 18th. We're going to spell WW, where we go one, we go all. Have you seen that? That's a great Q saying. And that's going to be our next Freedom Rocks event. Stay tuned. You can get on my Facebook at Don't California or Nevada. KKVV will have some information on it. And what we're inviting is not just the recently let go mounted police from Metro. They'll be there with horses and some the honor guard, but also our veterans because obviously on the heels of May 18th, what's coming up next? Memorial Day. So we're going to kind of get out in front of that and honor our vets of the past and honor our vets now and do the Where We Go One, We Go All for a Freedom Rocks event. So there's that. Yeah, so getting back to this quarantine thing, I was thinking about the 40 days and Noah's Ark and the start of the Federal Reserve being torn down, ending on Easter. And then remember Trump said that, well, he wanted to have the country open up on Easter, but it might take a little longer. I remember him saying those words. Well, he knew that the governors were going to play this out and try to be communist and shut us down. And I've I've been a little surprised because some of Trump's greatest supporters have been saying, well, Trump's not God and he can't reopen up our state. And, he is creating a more dangerous situation by encouraging people with COVID to come out. And no, he wasn't doing that at all. Basically, what he was saying is hey, there's this virus out there, which now we know on April 15th, Surgeon General Jerome Adams came in and said all those predictive models of CDC, WHO, and the Gates Foundation were completely abolished. They were going to, instead of using the predictive model, which was millions will die within days, they went to a real data and facts model. So that kind of set aside Dr. Birx and NIH and Dr. Fauci and all those other bad actor players. Because just think about it. If Trump wouldn't have taken this seriously from the beginning, then they would have come out against him and said, "Oh, Trump wants to try to kill you because he's not taking this virus seriously." No, he took it very seriously, but he used their own plan against them, which is great. But I do see things out there that are talking about Trump, and they're saying, well, Trump is not God and he can't tell the states what to do. And I agree, Trump is not God, obviously, but Trump is working and God is working through Trump. I'm absolutely sure of that. And look at all the things that he's done during the COVID crisis. And I'll give you an example that he's on our side. He kept the gun stores open. Our right to bear arms is a constitutional right. And when states tried to shut down the gun stores, he came to our aid and he said, federally, I'm going to be sure that all the gun stores can stay open. Now, they weren't open in the sense of you could walk in, but they had the drive-through service and getting, you know, permits and things like that and ammunition. So he made sure that the gun stores stayed open. And another thing that he is focusing on is the family. He talks about the family all the time and the natural family. And here we have his detractors now coming out. So the news in New York and Connecticut today on mainstream media was that males may want to consider cutting off their testicles because that's where the COVID virus lives. This is on mainstream media. Now, for common sense people, that's utterly, it's insanity because we know that it's a totally false premise and information. But we can see that now everything got escalated because they're in a total panic and depression. Uh, they know that it's the end. They're absolutely desperate. And all of the things that we've been saying all along about being on the attack, um, okay, that's when we are seeing it right now and how they're attacking the natural family. Um, let's see. Let's go to the next thing here. The banking system. So we talked about the banking system, and I wanted to bring in a few kind of news items from the last few days. So another thing that I've seen people talking about Trump is that, well, he's got this this federal disaster area, and he's calling up troops, and he shouldn't be calling up troops. Well, yes, actually, he should be, because he knows many of these communist governors want to try to suppress us and take us out. So he's allowed the National Guard to have kind of been slowly working their way into the states, and obviously they have a plan at hand. But let's look at some of the orders. And I kind of wrote these down. So just today, April 21st, let's see, Donald Trump announces appointments for the executive office of the president. One, two, three, four, five, six. Six brand new players. You don't think this was all coordinated from the beginning? Oh, it was. And they're going to be taking over. A lot of this is for planning and implementation, assistant to the president and press secretary, director of strategic communications, director of Oval Office operations. Appointments for the executive office of the president also include Dan Scavino. He's the assistant to the president and the deputy chief of staff of communications. Why did he wait until April 21st to do this? Well, we said if it gets too dangerous for the president to be at the White House, he will be on Air Force One and his staff will be running everything. I think he's getting ready. He knows that they're desperate. He knows that they're in a corner. And all these appointments were done because th- they're, things are that bad. Um, I'd like to look at this other. So this was a few weeks ago. I came across this on April 6th. On April 6th, Executive Order on Encouraging International Support for the Recovery and the Use of Space Resources. Right here. Section 1, Policy. Space Policy Directive of December 11, 2017. Reinvigorating America's Human Space Exploration Program. Does anybody even recall ever hearing about this December 11, 2017? I didn't. I don't remember anything about it in the mainstream. I looked it up on, just kind of Reuters and Associated Press. Not a single word. So there's our first cue. When the press doesn't mention anything, we know we should be looking at it. So here's what this executive order says. It says successful long-term exploration and scientific discovery of the moon, Mars, and other celestial bodies will require partnership with commercial entities, so that's private enterprise, to recover and use resources, including water and certain minerals in outer space. It says the uncertainty regarding the right to recover and use space resources, including the extension of the right to commercial recovery and the use of lunar resources, however, has discouraged some commercial entities from participating in this enterprise. And it goes on to talk about the 1979 agreement governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. And says this establishes the legal framework. Okay. Um, let's see. Governing the activities of states on the moon and other celestial bodies. As, and then this one has in it, it says specifically, the United States has neither signed nor ratified the Moon Agreement. In fact, only 18 countries have ratified the Moon Agreement, including just 17 of the 95 member states of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So that's not even, that's almost 20% of the signers of the member states. So that means 80% don't agree that space shouldn't have been used for peaceful uses. And, this is tying into something, so if you stay with me. It says Americans should have the right to engage in commercial exploration, recovery, and use of resources in outer space, consistent with applicable law. Outer space is a legally and physically unique domain of human activity, and the United States does not view it as a global commons. That's very interesting. What do you think he might be setting us up for? Well, I'm thinking about it, and I'm looking at some of the facts that we have available and thinking, why is he suddenly coming out with this month, and what do we need to know about the moon and outer space, and how does it tie to COVID? Well, we'll talk about it when we come back in a minute. Hi, we're back, and we were just talking about the moon agreement in the first half hour, and we'll be discussing it a little more now. So it says in Section 2 of this, the Moon Agreement, the United States is not a party to the Moon Agreement. Further, the U.S. does not consider the Moon Agreement to be an effective or necessary instrument to guide nation states regarding the promotion of commercial participation in the long-term exploration, scientific discovery, and the use of the Moon, Mars, or other celestial bodies. Accordingly, the Secretary of State shall object to any attempt by any other state or international organization to treat the Moon Agreement as reflecting or otherwise expressing customary international law. So let's look at this for a second. We've got the chair of the National Space Council making a report very soon under this directive, and it says no later than 180 days after this order. Okay, well, look at China. Why has China been such a powerhouse and using their force over the the United States? China has a massive space program. And what's in outer space? Surveillance. Surveillance is part of everything happening in space. Because when you look up at the satellite program and there's all kinds of different apps and things you can look at regarding the satellite programs, but satellites are absolutely essential and critical to the world surveillance for the New World Order. Now, why does this tie back to COVID? Well, it ties in perfectly because satellite communications ties into cell phone use. And cell phone use tied into the data collection that Dr. Burke said is taking place regarding the flu, the COVID 19. What they were doing is they were triangulating people's positioning regarding their cell phone and their activities so that they were maintaining social distance. So if we think about this as a big brother solution, this was the Orwellian nightmare that we were told about originally going to happen in 1984. This is happening now. And how they were doing it is states had set up the communist system of social distancing. Then they were using space and cell phone triangulation to make sure that they were going to be able to warn us, ticket us, control us if we weren't keeping our distance from people and using our cell phones. So this is a really critical thing that it's happening right now and that it came out right before COVID. Well, actually during COVID. So that all started up in March and then this came out. And it came out right after Trump got the gold for the United States. So when we're not looking at something, we need to be looking at it. And one of the things is the space program. The other thing is, so this is April 20th, a memorandum on providing continued federal support for governors' use of the National Guard to respond to COVID-19 and to facilitate economic recovery. So it starts out, it's a memorandum for the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Homeland Security. It says, on March 13th, I declared a national emergency recognizing the threat. Recognizing the threat. He didn't say that it was a must. The disease caused by the novel new coronavirus known as SARS-CoV-2, the virus. And the virus poses to the nation's healthcare systems. So he just kind of goes on and says that this is the emergency of a nationwide scope, and he's going to be calling in the National Guard. And he set aside a 100% federal cost share on all of this. I'm directing FEMA and the Department of Homeland Security to fund 100% of the emergency assistance activities associated with preventing, mitigating, and responding to the threat to public health and safety posed by the virus that these states undertake using their National Guard forces. So here's what he did. Governors call up the National Guard, but the many people said that this was martial law and they didn't want any part of it, and that Trump was being Mussolini. No, he wasn't. He's protecting us. And then bringing in the National Guard made sure that if anybody doing harm to the American people were going to be suppressing us in any way with a military force, say, turning law enforcement against the people, he was going to be sure that the National Guard was there to protect us. And he was funding it 100% so that states couldn't say, well, we can't afford that or it's not in the budget. So he just extended this. Hmm. Why do you think he might be extending it? Now, this memorandum was dated March 22nd and it was updated the 28th and the 30th and April 2nd, the 7th, and the 13th, each titled Providing Federal Support for Governor's Use of the National Guard to Respond to COVID-19. Well, now he extended it to May 31st. That's quite a long time. So we're not out of the woods yet. He thinks the governors have something else up their sleeve, and he's going to keep the National Guard around to keep the people safe. So we need to kind of update ourselves and stay on that. Uh, would love to hear from you out there in KKVV land, and I hope that you'll give me a call. The next thing is I was going through some of this. Have you ever heard of, um, well, thefederalist.com? That's a great website to go to, but also the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers are the explanation of Publius talking about the Constitution and why they were doing it. That's just like Q. Q is the same way. Q is the anonymous military operations that was explaining the freeing of the nation from its bondage. Okay, just like the settlers were being told why the Constitution was necessary to be freed from the bondage of the crown. So I came across this fantastic article about how the Constitution protects our right to worship, to own property, and to thrive. And I love that word thrive because that's what we're here to do. God wants us to celebrate. He wants us to be grateful to Jesus that He shed His blood for us. And then He wants us to thrive. But what's keeping us from thriving? Well, some of us have issues and problems that we're dealing with. That's keeping us from thriving. We have fear through the fear porn mainstream media. That's keeping us from thriving. There is regulatory suppression. That will keep us from thriving. And lots of people right now are losing their livelihood and their businesses over a fake scam by governors to shut down their states unnecessarily, and people are losing their livelihoods. So I urge you to go to righttoworship.com, check out the pledge, sign up because there's class action lawsuits happening and we want to let you know about them. So anyway, back to this. How the Constitution protects our right to worship, own property, and to thrive. The founders understood that freedom was not merely the unbridled ability to live according to one's appetites and desires, but the ability to do what is right and to live virtuous lives. Because remember, liberty equals freedoms with conscious living. So, prior to the American Revolution, the freedom to practice one's faith was limited to those who accepted the religion of the state-sponsored church. Now, how many of us know? So I'll divert for a second. How many of us knew that there was basically one state-sponsored church? That's communism. That's what they have in China right now. And this whole process, I mean, do you remember that from high school, middle school, that there was one state-sponsored church? I didn't. But that's why history is so important. And we need to honor what their history was so that we don't repeat the bad history. So anyway, let me go back to state-sponsored church. This changed after settlers first started to come to the United States. But religious freedom isn't limitless, and the founders had to grapple with what constraints upon religion are necessary to preserve everyone's right to worship. One cannot disturb the public peace or infringe upon another's rights in the name of religion. Therefore, child sacrifices or harming others as part of a religious practice isn't ever permissible, for that infringes upon their natural rights. At the time of the American founders, The Quakers, who are pacifists, refused to serve in the armed forces if the young nation needed to defend itself. And in a stern letter addressed to the Society of the Quakers, George Washington told the Quakers they must fulfill their duties as citizens if the country needs to take up arms to defend itself, and for the neglect of social duties necessary to maintain religious freedom is to put that very right at risk. And here's what the letter said: the liberty enjoyed by the people of these states of worshiping Almighty God agreeable to their consciousness is not only among the choicest of their blessings, but also of their rights. While men perform their social duties faithfully, they do all that, and let's see, the society of their state can with propriety demand or expect, and remain responsible only to their Maker for the religion or modes of faith which they may prefer or profess. So anyway, there was another letter to the Danbury Baptist Association that Thomas Jefferson wrote that no government could interfere in a religious issue at a state level. Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment or of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see that with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. So let's look at that. I mean, the left always throws that up in our face. You can't tell me about God. Church and state are separate. That's one of their go-to arguments. But we were a nation under God, and our government was only there relegated to the duties to protect our life, liberty, and property. And we were supposed to be a virtuous society. So when he says that, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, we have to be reminded of that. That this was not necessarily to say that the state should have no church. They were always together because the church, and that could be myself and God, the two of us, me talking to God and God talking to me, that's a church. It is not necessarily a brick and mortar place. It's not a body of people, although it can be. It starts with the sovereignty of the individual. So that was just so interesting. Also, in this great article, it talks about the right to acquire and possess property, and it's essential. So look at how we've been moved into this massive rental urban system to get us away from owning property. If we don't own property, we can be dislodged easier. We have nothing to fall back on. We don't defend it because, oh, things get tough here, I'll just move somewhere else. So that's why property is so critical to the lives of Americans who value their individuality and their sovereignty. So the right to acquire and possess property is essential to our system, but you see all the ways that it's been breaking down. So market freedom was a critical liberty protected by the Constitution, and the right to travel and have access to common carriers such as ships, trains, etc. is important to facilitate commercial freedom. Congress was also granted the rights to regulate markets in order to ensure that everyone has the ability to acquire and possess property. The founder understood that there must be clear title exchanges and that the ownership must not be restricted to merely occupancy. See the difference? So this is a whole nother issue that if you have a favorite candidate for office, ask them about this. Ask them why we don't have better title laws in Nevada. Some of our ownership laws here are bad, especially for water. Water rights is one of those big issues that when you control the water, when you control the power, you control the people. And go back to COVID-19. In the governor's original executive orders, there's 5 various titles that were not named in the order specifically by uh, republishing the title itself, but there was indications. Well, I looked them all up, and guess what one was? It was the right to water. So our legislature over the past 10 years has been degrading all of the water rights in Nevada of the people. And they've been doing them in a myriad of ways. So for example, in Pahrump, Utilities Inc., and that is a company that is associated with Gregory Hafen, they have been dividing the water rights from the land. Now, this is going on all across America, but they have been saying in Nevada that because we have an alleged water shortage, that this was necessary. So people in buying land in Pahrump were maybe buying 4 or 5 acres for 20 or 30,000. Now the same acreage cost 80,000 because the water rights are 60,000 and the land is 20,000. So the water, I mean, water's the new gold. If we don't have water, we can't grow our own food, we can't take care of ourselves, which was the whole purpose behind the New World Order. So possession of property and property rights is absolutely critical, but we cannot, as vigilant citizens, say we can't fight City Hall. We have to change our ways and making ourselves not only knowledgeable but proactive. And you can say that activism is something that is, it's not for you and that you'll just pray about it and we can go to church and it's something that you are passive to. But if you're passive for too long, the government will come and take your rights. They'll take every right. And it's just a matter of how fast and how slow. So we've got this time period right now where we can retrain ourselves to be knowledgeable about everything that we should be defending. Because if America does not learn how to defend their property, we're going to be right back where we started pro-Trump days in another 10 years or 15 years. It's not going to take that long because people forget, they'll get comfortable, everything will get smoothed over, and then we'll be subject to these terrible rules that, keep us from our rights. So I did want to just, try to get that across today, that how special America is and how the right to acquire and possess property is. Now, property, I'm not saying is, it's different from material things. And yes, property is a material thing, but I think we can all agree that the consumerism mentality in, having long-term loans and doing all of this has an effect on our culture. And, the Me Too movement didn't just end at the what we think of as the Me Too movement. It was the, one up the neighbor and I've got a fancier car and we all live in mansions. No, that's not really what we're talking about here. I mean, even if you live in the most humblest of abodes, you still need water to, take care of yourself. But just to drive home the point, about 10 years ago, The Southern Nevada Water District set up laws around xeriscaping. Now, they easily convinced homeowners that there wasn't enough water, there was a water shortage, xeriscaping would end the water shortage, and, you know, we should all be planting cactus in our yards. Well, how this degraded our property values was if you read the xeriscaping contracts, it will say that growing any type of food is illegal. And that could be lemon trees, it could be a tomato plant, it could be a pepper plant. But look at your xeriscaping contract and then start calling up your representatives in government because we have a legislative session coming up again in January and ask them what they're going to do about taking back our water rights regarding xeriscaping. Because if we can't grow our own food and we're not able to take care of ourselves, eventually the day could come where we will cease to exist because we can't take care of ourselves. And by the way, you can, you've got the, I'll call it the brown shirt army all around you calling the Southern Nevada Water District, this person's growing corn, or this other person's got bean plants. That's what it all kind of came down to. And we saw that perfectly in what I'll call the instant Islamation of America when we were all muzzled. We got muzzled by face masks overnight, and that is exactly like Islam muzzling women who they don't want to hear from. They have no value from their opinions and their thoughts and their words. And boy, wasn't that easy. So the government can come in and take our rights at any time. We cannot leave these laws on the books. We've got to change it. And if we can start now, start the process. In fact, you can send me an email at americanfirst@fastmail.com, and that's American First, F-I-R-S-T, at fastmail. And send me your concerns and issues, and let's hear from you on what you think. And here's another one. This just came up. A listener last week contacted me. They had no knowledge that they needed a smart meter on their house for a solar installation, which gives off EMFs that causes cancer, and that the solar contract was considered real estate, which means the real estate lien on their property was going to prevent them from selling their home. So, how it worked was the home had a regular roof, they added solar. They didn't realize that the solar contract was not just for the solar panels, but for the life of the time that the panels would have created energy. So the solar contract ended up being this huge amount of money. They didn't have the equity in the home to cover it. And they got into a pinch because they wanted to sell their home and they couldn't. So there's lots of, I'll call it obstacles and things in our way. And I, for one, want to see that our next legislative session be a cleanup session. If they need to go to Carson City a little early or stay a little longer, because our legislative session here is only 4 months long, I think we need to do it. And I'd like to hear about some of the things that you want to have cleaned up in Carson City in January 2021. Actually, it'd be February. And let's talk about that with some of the candidates that we're going to have on air in the next few weeks. But folks, if we don't start protecting our own property rights, we cannot afford to think that our political candidates are going to do it for us. One, they're very busy. Two, they could be in the pocket of special interest, or three, they just simply may not have the wherewithal to understand the situation. So, property rights is something that we've got to, this is something easy. We need to get this back. And I look forward to hearing from you. I hope that I hear from you and that you start looking around at some of the contracts, some of the things that have, look at what's happened in the last few weeks. The governor took away our right to travel, our right to exercise our religious freedom, a right to congregate, not more than 10 people being in a space at any one time. We cannot allow our government to tell us how to live because we're all living for God. And if we're here, that means that it's our duty while we're here to defend our rights. So I hope that we meet each other soon. And this is Denise Mraz on Vegas Views. And if you get a chance, go to my website at www.don'tcaliforniaornevada.com and check it out. Got a great blog there, 65 articles. And oh, here's one more thing. Bards of War, Bards, Bards of War. He's one of those blogs that I love to listen to. He's got a lot of episodes, and I hope that you listen to him, and we'll see you soon. And Denise Mraz here with Vegas Views. Thanks so much.